On the trail of the Pilgrims. So what did our ancestors encounter once they set foot on the New World? Where did they go? What were the paths that they trod? How did they find Plymouth? That's what we're going to talk about today. Now we know they got a late start crossing the sea. It wasn't until September 16th of 1620, after the two other previous attempts that failed because of the leaky speedwell. So they got a very late start crossing. Once they left Plymouth, New England on the 16th of September, it took 66 days to cross the ocean. Now they were blown off course during some of the storms and the high winds. It put them further north than they should have been. They were supposed to land at the mouth of the Hudson River. So that means they would have founded where modern day Manhattan, New York City is. But once they spotted land and they started going around the outside arm of Cape Cod, because Cape Cod looks like an arm. So once they got about to the outside elbow of the arm of Cape Cod, there are these rocky shoals there, and there have been many, many shipwrecks there. So Captain Christopher Jones decides to make an executive and very historic decision to turn the boat around and land it at Cape Cod Harbor. Now, how did he know he could land the ship at Cape Cod Harbor? Well, in the early 1600s, a man named Samuel Champlain had done a very extensive exploration of the area of New England. And so he created these wonderful detailed maps that listed all the harbors and inlets. So they docked the ship on the night of November 10th at Cape Cod Harbor. And it's a Saturday night, so the next day is Sunday. So you know what that means? No exploring on that day. So they stayed on the ship and worshiped, and they also created the Mayflower Compact. I don't know about you, but I would have been beside myself if we were that close to land and we couldn't get off the boat. But anyway, so they finally set out to do their first exploration on the 12th. By the 16th, they finally came across some fresh water, and they called it Pilgrim Spring. Pilgrim Spring is today a very small little dab of water. I'm sure back then it was much larger, but I was there a couple years ago, and so I hiked out to it, and it's a little bit of a walk to get to it, and there is a marker there. Well, once they got their first drink of water, Bradford writes in his book, A Plymouth Plantation, "We drank our first New England water with as much delight as we ever drink in all our lives." So the next day, they continue on after getting refreshed with water. They end up about 3 miles southwest, and they stop at a spot to camp, and it's a freshwater pond, and so we'll call that Pilgrim Pond. So they spent the night there. The next morning they got up to do some more exploration, and they come across a Indian campsite, and it's been abandoned, but there is a large kettle there, and they find this very large cache of corn. Now obviously the Indians were going to come back at some point, for that. So with much debate, they discuss whether or not they should take this corn, and they decide, yeah, we are starving, we need to take the corn. So they intended on leaving an IOU, but they couldn't find any paper and pencil, so no. They intended on repaying them. I don't know how they figured the Indians would know that, but that's what their intention was. The site where they found the corn is called Corn Hill. Today there is a housing development that was put there about 100 years ago with these little cute cottages. So they're going to continue exploring, and at some point they stumble upon a grave, and they dig it up, and they find that it's a white man and a child, and they know it's a white man because there's still blonde hair on the skull. It's most likely that the Nauset Indians had been watching them this whole time, so they saw what they were doing. Now they finally do some exploring on the inner arm of Cape Cod. So they jump in their shallop, and they're exploring on the 6th and the 7th, and then they, on the night of the 7th, they're camped ashore, and they wake up on the 8th to do some worship, and then all of a sudden they are attacked by some Indian arrows. So they quickly grab their guns and they shoot back, and the Indians do retreat and nobody was hurt. The beach that they were encamped on where this happened is called today First Encounter Beach, and it is actually a very lovely beach. The locals go there all the time, and I have pictures of that. It's a stop you can make on the Pilgrim Trail. So they jump into the shallop after being attacked, and they end up getting to a bit of a storm, and they kind of get shipwrecked, and they end up on an island called Clark's Island. And it's a Friday night, so all day Saturday they decide that they need to repair the boat. So they had damage to a rudder and a mast, and dry out their clothes. Well, the next day is going to be Sunday, and that is a day of worship. So there's going to be no exploring that day. However, they do have worship services next to a very large rock that we today call Pulpit Rock. So Monday, they're going to set out across the harbor, and they're going to discover a wonderful place to put the plantation. And this is Plymouth. It was called Pawtuxet. Of course, they didn't know that, but the Pawtuxet tribe lived there, and that is why it was such a perfect place. There was a freshwater spring, and the area had been cleared out. However, the Pawtuxet tribe had been completely wiped out because of disease that was brought over by the white man. And they were completely wiped out except for one person, and that was Tisquanto, also known as Squanto. Squanto had been captured by Thomas Hunt, and twice, not only once, he had been captured twice and escaped back to America. However, they estimate he might have been away from his home for about 12 years. So this gave him ample time to learn the English language. And that is why Squanto is able to live with the Pilgrims and help them establish their new plantation by teaching them how to plant and how to survive in this new world. So they go back and get the rest of the group from the ship, and they come back to Plymouth and step onto Plymouth Rock. Now, how do we know they really stepped on Plymouth Rock? Well, I'm going to tell you. First, let me say that the rock is not quite as large as it once was. People have chipped away at it. There are, as for souvenirs, there's even a piece of it in the Smithsonian and different places. So we know the rock was actually larger than it was. But in 1741, the town of Plymouth was going to put a wharf over the rock. So a man named Thomas Founds hears about this, and he lives just about 3 miles outside of town. He's 95 years old, and when he hears about this, he walks into town to tell them that they can't do this because the rock was where the Pilgrims first landed when they arrived. Well, the reason he knew this was because he was born in 1646, so he was born at a time when the Pilgrim our founding fathers were still alive, and he was told by his father, as well as other people in town, that this is what happened, that the Pilgrims first stepped foot on that rock. And because Thomas Founds was so respected and had such a good reputation, integrity, the townspeople believed it to be true. And so that is why we believe that Plymouth Rock is where the Pilgrims first set foot. So the current canopy that it sits over Plymouth Rock that you see today was put there by the Society of the Colonial Dames of America, and that was in 1920 for the 300th anniversary celebration. So across from the rock is Coles Hill, and in 1743 there was a terrible rainstorm with water that was flooding down Middle Street and going right over Coles Hill, and because of that storm it uncovered a bunch of bones. And it is believed that those bones were the Pilgrims that died that first winter. Remember, about half the Pilgrims died that very first winter. Also, it happened again in 1867 and 1879. More of the skeletons were uncovered. And The bones were placed in the canopy at that time of the Forefathers rock canopy, which was the original canopy that stood over the rock. But the Mayflower Society, the General Society of Mayflower Descendants, decided to build in 1921 the sarcophagus to house the bones of the Mayflower descendants from that first winter. Now, it's believed that the reason those bones were in unmarked graves was because so many people were dying and we still didn't know what our relationship with the Native Americans were going to be. So they were fearful that if they knew that we were losing that many people, we would be weak and they would be able to take us easily. So it was done in secrecy. So anyway, so next we're going to head down the street just a little bit further and back on the side of the Mayflower Rock, or the Plymouth Rock, and that is a William Bradford statue. Now, this statue was built or created, sculpted by a man named Cyrus Dallin. Cyrus Dallin also did the Massasoit statue, and he's responsible for the Paul Revere statue in front of the old, or behind the Old North Church in Boston. But it was meant for the 300th anniversary, but it wasn't quite completed until 1976. So then they unveiled it for the Thanksgiving celebration. It is close to life size, and you know, John Carver was the original governor of Plymouth, but he died early on, and Bradford became governor, and he actually served as governor most of his life without interruption, and he died in 1657. I also want to point out that William Bradford wrote of Plymouth Plantation, and that is how we know the Pilgrim story. The book was handed down through his descendants after he died, and it finally ended up for safekeeping in the Old South Meeting House in Boston. And during the Revolutionary War, the British soldiers occupied Boston, and they took over the Old South Meeting House. They gutted it, they destroyed it, and they turned it into a horse arena. But they must have found where the manuscript was hidden because it disappeared after that. So we assume that the British soldiers took the manuscript back to England. And it wasn't actually discovered until 1855, and it was in the Bishop's Library in London. In 1897, they did return it to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and by 1901, they printed it and published it for the public. Across from the Plymouth Rock and the William Bradford statue is the statue of Massasoit on Coles Hill. The statue was sculpted by Cyrus Dallin, and it is a depiction of the chief of the Wampanoag Indians. And it was given to us by the Improved Order of Red Men and the Daughters of Pocahontas. Now, this statue was dedicated on September 3rd, 1921, and it's depicting Massasoit watching as the Mayflower comes into harbor. So just a little bit south of the Massasoit statue is a street called Leiden Street. Now, this is the first street in Plymouth. In fact, that's what they called it, First Street. It was changed later to Leiden Street, after Leiden, Holland, of course. The first building coming up on your left-hand side, going up the street from the sea, is the Common House. And there is a plaque there depicting that it is the Common House, which was the first building that they built and lived all together that first winter. This is also where the treaty with Massasoit was signed on April 1st of 1621. Going up the street a little bit further, on the right-hand side, you'll find a plaque for the Samuel Fuller House. You'll find a stone marker for where John Halland lived. And back again on the left-hand side at the corner of Leiden and Main Street is where the Brewster House was, William Brewster. And behind the Brewster House, you'll find the Brewster Gardens. And this is the site of his original garden. However, it was made into a park in the 1920s. And you will find this is where the town brook was. So that famous brook where the fresh water was. Of course, it's a little bit smaller than it was at the time of the Pilgrims. Also in this park, there's the Pilgrim Maiden statue, which was put there by the National Society of New England Women in 1924. And it is in honor of this single woman that came over on the Mayflower with such courage and fortitude. So just across the street and a little bit north of where the rock is the Pilgrim Mother statue. And this memorial honors those women that came over on the Mayflower. It honors 29 women. 18 of them were married, 10 of them were children, and 1 was a servant. Now on the back side of the memorial, it will list all of their names. At the top of Leiden Street sits First Parish Church. This is the 5th building that is on the site, and this one was built in 1899. It is thought that this is probably the site where the fort and the meeting house was, but it's not exactly known for sure. Now behind the church is Burial Hill. So a lot of our Pilgrim ancestors are buried in Burial Hill, but the oldest marker in Burial Hill dates to 1681 for a man named Edward Gray. Now, it's thought that John Halland, who was buried in 1672, that his marker is older, but they've now determined that they think that the marker is not the original one. So we're not sure about that. However, a lot of times in these old cemeteries, especially in New England, that are, some people are buried from the 1600s, the 1700s, the tombstones may have been rearranged. So the exact marker with the exact body may not be correct. However, it's a fun cemetery to visit, and I know cemeteries maybe shouldn't be fun, but a lot of the New England ones are very interesting. The tombstones have really interesting words on them. But this is a great cemetery to walk around, search for your ancestors. It also has a tremendous view of the ocean from the top. Just off Allerton Street is the Forefathers Monument. This was commissioned by the Pilgrim Society and was dedicated in 1889. It's an 81-foot tall monument depicting the coming of our ancestors. There's 4 wings. You have morality, education, law, and freedom. And each wing depicts different scenes. There's one that is the departure from Holland, the signing of the compact, the landing of the Pilgrims, and the treaty with Massasoit. It is truly a beautiful monument. And I have the most amazing picture that I took at one point as the sun was setting. Just a little ways up from the rock, you will find Mayflower 2 in the harbor. Now, Mayflower 2, of course, is not the original Mayflower. It was a gift to us in 1957 from England. And she was created through private donations, and she was created in the original manner that you would have created a ship of that time, using all hand tools, etc. She recently underwent a huge restoration and was down in Mystic, Connecticut for a few years undergoing restoration. As a tour guide, I got to experience the whole process. So every year in the fall when I would do my tours, I would get to see the progress on Mayflower 2 because Mystic, Connecticut was one of the stops on one of the tours that I do. So it was quite a process to watch them do it. And of course they did it in the old style, all with hand tools, Anyway, so you can board the Plymouth 2. It's also part of your ticket if you go to Plymouth Plantation, which is going to be changing the name at the end of the year to Plymouth and Pawtuxet. Plymouth Plantation is a not miss. Plymouth Plantation is a recreation of the original village of the Mayflower, our Mayflower descendants. It sits on land that was once owned by the Warren ancestors. So if you are Warren descendants, you'll notice as you're driving up, you're going up Warren Drive, and when you're on the plantation, you're looking out over Warren's Cove. Anyway, it's a real life kind of a replica. If you go to Plymouth Plantation, first you will walk into the Indian village, and they are dressed as Native Americans, and you can speak to them and ask them questions, and they will talk to you in current day time. However, when you get to Plymouth Plantation, where our Pilgrim ancestors are, they are in the year 1626, so they will talk to you in that year. So if you tell them you're from Kansas, they have no idea what Kansas is. So they stay totally in role. And it's really interesting to talk to them because they study the characters that they are portraying. So you can ask them any questions, but again, you will not be able to get any answers for modern day questions. So I have just given you a small list of things that you could see that relate to our Pilgrim ancestors when you visit Cape Cod or you visit Plymouth. There's so much there to see and explore, and you can go back again and again and see different stuff. So I hope you will take the opportunity to explore Plymouth and get to know what it was like for our ancestors, and walk the paths, walk the trails that they were on. And it's very rewarding. I hope you enjoyed my presentation on Cape Cod and Plymouth and the Trail of Our Ancestors. Thank you.